Even so, it took some time before the full force of these efforts was brought to bear. Much of the autumn of 1793 was absorbed in quelling and mopping up the various centers of revolt within France. The only striking success after Wattignies was partly such an operation. On 19 December, Toulon was recaptured and the British fleet driven out. The key role in the expulsion being played by the 25-year-old commander of the artillery, Napoleon Bonaparte. His rise began here, and within 2 months he was a general, planning a march into Italy. But the main front was still in Flanders, and here the coalition hoped to advance along the whole line for the spring campaign of 1794. Emperor Francis II even made the journey from Vienna to inspire his troops and flatter his Belgian subjects, who had never before been visited by their Austrian sovereign. But he did not impress them, nor they him, and he had gone back east. Alarmed by news from Poland, when the first major battle occurred at Tourcoing on 17-18 May, the French stopped a numerically superior coalition army from threatening key fortresses. Six weeks later, on 26th of June, the Austrians retreated after a bitterly fought confrontation at Fleurus. Even on the sea, against the reputedly invincible British, the French held their own. Over the winter, Carnot's colleague on the Committee of Public Safety, the ex-Protestant pastor Jambon Saint-André, had worked to restore the debilitated and demoralized Brest fleet. In mid-May, it put to sea in order to escort a major grain convoy from America into port, in what the British chose to call the glorious 1st of June. The French were seriously mauled, losing 13 ships, but the victors themselves were so exhausted that the convoy eluded them unharmed. Fleurus, however, was much the most important engagement. In fact, it marked the turning point of the whole war. From that moment, the French went on to the offensive, and they scarcely looked back until all their continental opponents had been knocked out of the conflict. and even the British were desperate to make peace. Thus, they began to reap the rewards of a year of desperate, frenzied activity. Yet, as in 1792, not all their success was attributable to their own efforts. Once again, the Poles distracted enemies at the crucial moment, encouraged by the sympathy with which his campaign against the Russians had been viewed in 1792. Kosciuszko made his way to Paris in January 1793 and spent 6 months trying to interest the new republic in supporting a renewed Polish insurrection. He received little more than fair words, and in August rejoined his fellow émigrés, massing in Leipzig and plotting a rising. Even though the French were offering no tangible help, their enemies were the same. Their apparent ability to generate mass enthusiasm was an inspiration. In the language of liberty, national rights, and representative government still had seductive echoes in traditional Polish political rhetoric. Kosciuszko was anxious to avoid a premature rising, but resentment at the Russian occupation within what was left of Poland was growing. In the spring of 1794, his hand was forced by a mutiny within the army, which the Russians were attempting to cut down from 50,000 to which it had grown during the 4 years' diet to a mere 15,000. The Russians could not be allowed, in putting the mutiny down, to decimate the force on which the plotters planned to rely. On 24th March, accordingly, Kosciuszko arrived in Krakow and proclaimed an insurrection. A fortnight later, he defeated a Russian force sent against him at Raklowice, 4th of April. And news of this success triggered uprisings against occupying garrisons in Vilno and, above all, Warsaw. Tricolor cockades sprouted everywhere. Polish translations of the Marseillaise and the Ça Ira appeared, and a society of Friends of the National Insurrection, which everyone recognized as a Jacobin club, was established. The Russians withdrew from the capital after losing half their men to popular fury in an episode twice as bloody as the Paris September massacres of 1792. There were also popular reprisals against those associated with national betrayal in the Targowica Confederation. Kosciuszko dreamed of a Polish levée en masse to drive out foreign invaders, and fearing lest the noble ardor of the people grow cold, on 7th May, he issued a proclamation granting peasants personal freedom, diminishing the burdens owed to lords, and hinting at further freedoms to come. Not all the insurgent leaders, most of whom belonged to Poland's teeming nobility, thought such promises wise. Certainly, they only confirmed the most visceral prejudices of the partitioning monarchs and their advisors. Poland was clearly in the grip of international Jacobinism and the influence of what Frederick William II called the diabolical sect would not be stamped out until the whole of Poland was completely controlled by the forces of order. Determined to take a lead in this and make further gains into the bargain, the Prussians marched into Poland in May with the encouragement of Catherine II. They did not know that she was also secretly urging the Austrians to intervene in the south. They beat the Austrians to Krakow and joined forces with the Russians to besiege Warsaw. But in September, they were forced to withdraw to deal with a revolt in former Polish territory annexed in 1793. The Austrians now took the opportunity to occupy large stretches of South Poland, while the Russians decided to reduce Warsaw single-handed. To do this, they sent General Alexander Suvorov, a veteran campaigner from savage Balkan wars, who, having defeated Kosciuszko at Maciejowice at the beginning of October, advanced on the capital with overwhelming force. On 4th November, he stormed Praga, its suburb beyond the Vistula, where the Russian troops took pitiless revenge for their treatment 6 months previously. Anything between 10,000 and 20,000 Poles died that day when, as Suvorov proudly reported, the whole of Praga was strewn with dead bodies. Blood was flowing in the streams. Watching the most destructive one-day massacre in this entire decade of appalling carnage, the inhabitants of Warsaw realized that their only hope was to negotiate surrender. Within days, it was agreed. By the end of 1794, the last convulsion of independent Poland was over, and Kosciuszko was a prisoner in St. Petersburg. The surrounding powers had decided to partition the country out of existence long before the fighting was over. They spent much of 1795, however, haggling over precisely how the spoils were to be carved up. And for several months in the spring, it looked as if Prussia would fight the other two for a larger share. In preparation for this eventuality, she concluded an armistice with France in November 1794 and began to negotiate a definitive peace. In practice, she had already played no part in the war in the West for over 18 months. It was ironic that until it was almost over, the French refused to think of helping a Polish uprising that looked to France for inspiration, copied the French revolutionary style and language, was identified by its opponents as plainly Jacobinical, and so much to take pressure off France while she confronted her internal problems. But fraternity and assistance to foreign sympathizers was a Girondin policy. The Montagnards, who held power in 1793 and 1794, were interested in securing the revolution in France than exporting it to others. Thus, it was not until November 1794, when Warsaw had finally fallen, although they did not yet know that policymakers in France began to think seriously about the Poles. And by then, the success of the French armies was exporting the revolution anyway. After Fleurus, the Austrians abandoned Belgium, and by the end of the summer, the French had reoccupied the whole of it. Thugut declared openly that recovering it was not worth the effort. Once more, too, the French moved into the southern provinces of the Dutch Republic, reawakening in the defeated patriots of 1787 all the hopes and expectations so abruptly dashed in 1793. Clubs of patriots, thinly disguised as reading societies, mushroomed north of the Rhine mouths. And as the Prussians began to negotiate with the French, the stadtholder saw his chief bulwark since 1787 begin to melt away. He remained strong enough in the autumn to destroy a premature pro-French conspiracy, but with the onset of one of the coldest winters of the century, the rivers froze and thereby destroyed Holland's main line of defense. The French poured across, and such were the depredations of what was left of York's British army retreating before them, that it was not only long-standing Dutch patriots who welcomed them. On 18 January, William V embarked for England as groups of patriots ousted his minions from power in town after town across the country. The transfer of power was remarkably bloodless, perhaps because it happened before rather than after the invaders actually arrived. The Patriots believed and encouraged others to believe the sincerity of French promises before the invasion that once that stooge of the British and Prussians, William V, had been dislodged from power, the Dutch would be left free to organize themselves and pursue policies as they wished. In this, however, they deluded themselves. The true French view was trenchantly expressed by one of their generals. Holland has done nothing to avoid being classed among the general order of our conquests. It was the ice, the indefatigable courage of our troops, and the talents of the generals which delivered her, and not any revolution. It follows from this that there can be no reason to treat her any differently from a conquered country. With very few exceptions, the patriots of this country are all timid adventurers, led by ambitious intriguers, avid speculators who never dared to take up arms in our favor. Throughout the century, the French had always believed the Dutch to be fabulously rich, and the temptation to mulct their assets for French purposes was irresistible. So the peace treaty signed at The Hague in May was punitive. The Batavian Republic, as it now officially became, was required to pay a war indemnity of 100 million florins and lend France 100 million more at concessionary rates of interest. It was compelled to cede various southern territories, including control of the mouth of the Scheldt, and pay for the upkeep of a French occupying army of 25,000 men. Finally, it was forced to conclude an alliance with the French Republic, whose chief attraction was to place the supposedly formidable Dutch navy in the balance against Great Britain. This, then, was what the fraternity and help of the French Republic actually meant. Total subordination to French needs and purposes. It was an awful warning to other French sympathizers elsewhere in Europe, although entirely confirming the expectations of their far more numerous opponents. Nor did the full implications for the Dutch become apparent at once. What was very clear by May 1795, however, was that the coalition of 1793 was rapidly breaking up. A month before the French accepted the French terms, the Dutch accepted the French terms. Prussia had finally withdrawn. By the Treaty of Basle, signed on 5th April, she left France a free hand along the entire length of the Rhine's left bank, including occupation of Prussian territories, in return for a recognition of Prussian hegemony in North Germany, that region's neutralization. The agreement came too late to free Prussia to pursue all she wanted with her full strength in Poland, but it left the Rhenish princes and electors at the Republic's mercy. French occupying troops set about systematically exploiting this hitherto prosperous region to fund the French war effort. Then, in July, peace was also made again at Basla with Spain. By the end of 1794, the Spanish forces had been driven out of Roussillon, and the French were advancing into Catalonia and the Basque provinces. They met a population far more resolute in its resistance to the godless invaders than other fronts. But the court of Madrid was obsessed by fears of pro-French subversion. "In the taverns and in the fashionable salons," wrote a Madrid priest, "all one hears is battles, revolution, convention, national representation, liberty, equality. Even the whores ask you about Robespierre." In February 1795, plans for a Republican uprising were uncovered. The conspirators, a group of teachers and lawyers led by an educational theorist called Picornell, were condemned to death, but reprieved on French insistence when peace was concluded. This plot and rumors of others had been enough to scare Godoy, the Queen's feckless favorite who dominated the government, in seeking terms. In France, not really threatened by Spain, but anxious to transfer troops east for use against the Austrians, was prepared to be magnanimous. In Europe, she demanded nothing more than Spanish good offices in bringing Portugal and minor Italian states to the conference table. Overseas, Spain ceded the eastern part of Saint Domingue, but with the French West in chaos, and the Caribbean dominated by the British, France was in no position to take much immediate advantage of the game. The real importance of peace with Prussia and Spain was to free French resources for a knockout blow against what was left of the coalition. By August 1795, that meant Portugal, Sardinia, a number of minor Italian states, and above all, Great Britain and Austria. Austria looked by far the most vulnerable, distracted in the east, abandoned even by the Grand Duke of Tuscany, the Emperor's own brother, in February. She sustained her war effort only by borrowing from a suspicious Great Britain. She also had her own internal dissidents. Amid a general and increasing war weariness and a wave of public sympathy for the beleaguered Poles, especially in Hungary, police spies identified a group of Jacobins who had sent a peace mission to Paris and who held regular meetings to discuss the overthrow of the government. Between July and September 1794, 25 conspirators were arrested in Vienna and 34 in Hungary. The treasonable activities revealed at the trials of the Viennese amounted to little more than planting a liberty tree and taking rash oaths. But the leader of the Hungarian plotters, the ex-priest Martinovics, had plans for a republic, an attack on the church, and concessions to the serfs, similar to those proclaimed by Kosciuszko in May 1794. These ideas cost Martinovics his life in May 1795, along with 6 other convicted plotters. All except 6 of the rest were given long terms of imprisonment at the show trials designed to deter further toyings with Jacobinism. But the inspiration of the conspirators had been far more the memory of the reforming emperors Joseph and Leopold than a desire to ape France and what they most feared, the abandonment of the changes introduced since 1780. Now came about much more quickly thanks to the fright they had given Emperor Francis. Aware that, despite thwarting internal enemies, the threat from France was growing ever more serious, he sanctioned discreet peace feelers over the summer of 1795. But on 1st October, France showed its disdain for anything short of total victory when it declared once again that occupied Belgium was now French territory. Its former ruler was offered no compensation and so resolved to fight on. The same uncompromising annexation guaranteed continued commitment to the war on the part of the British. Pitt, too, in fact, had been putting out peace overtures after the breakup of the coalition. He continued to hope until the spring of 1796 that a new and uncertain government in France might yet offer concessions on Belgium. That would enable him to withdraw honorably from a struggle which was proving more costly in every sense than he had ever dreamed. Since the end of 1793, almost everything had gone wrong. Toulon had been lost. York's army in the Netherlands had performed dismally, and the coalition had come apart. In June 1795, an ambitious amphibious operation to land 3,300 men, mostly émigrés, on the Brittany coast at Quiberon Bay, there to link up with thousands more royalist Chouan guerrillas, ended in fiasco. After that, Pitt concentrated British efforts on the West Indies. French planters in Saint-Domingue were desperate for British protection against rebellious blacks, and a small force had been sent there in 1793. when the Spaniards gave up their part of the island to France. The attractions of a more sustained British occupation grew. Imitative slave uprisings swept the British West Indies too, early in 1795, while Republican privateers operated from Guadeloupe. Besides, there were obvious commercial advantages in trying to make the Caribbean a British lake. Thus, a huge expedition was sent there in November 1795 and eventually made the British islands secure and captured others. But it never subdued Guadeloupe or Saint Domingue. And in 1795, meanwhile, Pitt had to content himself with vaunting consolation prizes, like taking the Cape of Good Hope after the Dutch changed sides as triumphs. It was not even as if all was well at home. The massive surge of loyalism that had helped to carry the country into war lost momentum as the prospects of a swift victory dimmed. By the end of 1793, the corresponding societies, stunned into silence momentarily when their French inspiration became the enemy, had recovered their nerve and were campaigning against the war in favor once more of radical parliamentary reform. In Scotland, 2 national conventions of reform societies had been held despite the onset of war, while in Ireland, an unprecedented convention of representatives of the majority Catholic population called for full civil and political equality with the Protestants. Aware that the Irish Catholics, who knew what had happened to their church in France, were worth conciliating, Pitt forced a reluctant Irish parliament to concede them all except seats in the legislature early in 1793. But after that, there were no more concessions to reformers. One did not, declared Pitt, try to mend the roof in a hurricane. An overwhelming majority in Parliament agreed with him. Ever since Burke had come out against the revolution in 1790, the opposition Whigs had been falling apart, and in the summer of 1794, urged on by Burke, a number of leading Whigs joined the administration. Fox and the opponents of the war were left in a hapless minority, protesting in vain as publishers of Paynite propaganda were prosecuted for sedition. Scottish judges were seen sending organizers of conventions to Botany Bay, and the Irish Parliament banned them entirely. The very name convention now smacked of treason. And in 1794, treason was the charge brought in England against Hardy and other leading British Jacobins. The move followed the revelation that the spring the French had sent an agent through England to Ireland in order to report on the prospects for a pro-French uprising. Before his arrest in Dublin, he had made contact with the leaders of the United Irishmen, a non-sectarian group of parliamentary reformers founded in Belfast in 1791 and dedicated to weakening British control over Ireland. The English, on the other hand, he had reported, were not ripe for the pro-French rebellion, but Pitt feared otherwise. When, in a triumph for the jury system, all those accused of treason were acquitted December 1794, he turned to outright alteration of the laws. Habeas corpus had already been suspended in May 1794. And in November the next year, in the notorious 2 Acts, the scope of treasonable practices was widened. While magistrates were empowered to prevent the monster meetings which the reformed societies had come to favor over the summer, an attack on George III's coach as he drove to open Parliament in October triggered these new measures, whose application those affected soon labeled Pitt's reign of terror. In Ireland, meanwhile, the United Irishmen had been dissolved, and their founder, Wolfe Tone, suspected of encouraging French intervention, went into exile rather than face prosecution. He made his way to France, where from the spring of 1796, he began a lonely but persistent campaign to persuade the Directory that a French invasion of Ireland would bring an uprising so serious that Great Britain would be knocked out of the war. The Directory's prime target for 1796, however, was Austria. Now facing France without the support of any major continental ally, the plan was to strike through Germany in massive numbers at the Austrian heartland, distracting her meanwhile in the rear by a smaller force sent against her territories in Northern Ireland, Italy. At the last minute, Bonaparte, the victor of Toulon and since then remarkably sure-footed in domestic politics, was appointed to command the army of Italy. Compelled to improvise for lack of adequate supplies and equipment, he moved with quite unexpected speed, forced the Austrians to retreat, and during their confusion knocked Sardinia out of the war in a series of lightning battles. This was just a month after he had taken command. In the subsequent peace a few weeks later, 15th of May, Victor Amadeus III accepted the loss of Savoy and Nice, But by then, Bonaparte had descended from the Alps into the Lombard plains and had reached Milan. In all this time, the armies in Germany had scarcely advanced at all. The Italian theater had become the main one, and there was talk of dividing the command. Bonaparte made it clear that he would not tolerate such an affront, and his victorious troops were already so loyal to him personally that the directors shrank from testing their authority. Yet, they failed to reinforce him, too, while the Austrians, holding their own on the Rhine with surprising ease, were able to renew their Italian armies from their reserves. Thus, although the French, by a threatening southward march, were able to scare Naples and Parma into abandoning the coalition, they were too weak to take Mantua. Between August and January 1797, the Austrians sent no less than 4 armies down the Alpine passes to relieve it, each repulsed by Bonaparte in brilliant but increasingly desperate maneuvers. But after the last of these relief columns had been turned back at Rivoli, 14 January 1797, Mantua at last surrendered. Soon afterwards, the long-promised reinforcements arrived, and, unthreatened from the rear, Bonaparte turned north and began to advance towards Vienna. His position was not as strong as it looked. His lines of communication were dangerously extended, and there was unrest behind him in Venetian territory where, despite the Republic's neutrality, much of the campaign had been fought, and the French forces, as everywhere, were now living off the land. Nevertheless, he was now within 100 miles of Vienna, and there was panic in the imperial capital. Unknown to him, the French forces in Germany had at last crossed the Rhine, so that when he offered peace talks, the Austrians were ready to accept almost any terms he might suggest. To their surprise, the preliminaries of Leoben, which they accepted on 18th of April, were not as demanding or as damaging as they might have expected. That they were asked to accept the loss of Belgium came as no surprise. They had already written it off 3 years beforehand in practice. They also willingly recognized whatever French frontiers the laws of the Republic laid down, since whether that meant the left bank of the Rhine remained unclear. And although Bonaparte was not willing to give back Milan, he was prepared to acknowledge that Austria was entitled to some compensation for her losses. And he now proposed that she should take it at the expense of Venice. The revolts in Venetian territory proved the ideal excuse. And so now the ancient republic was carved up like Poland. The city itself and all its territory east of the Adige went to Austria, giving her an extensive Adriatic coastline. the French held on to the rest, which Bonaparte incorporated a few months later into a puppet Lombard state, the Cisalpine Republic. None of these terms was authorized from Paris. They came to the Directory and to the generals now at last making progress along the Rhine as a fait accompli. And in fact, they totally contravened the instructions Bonaparte had been given at the start of the Italian campaign and the clear war aims that the directors had been pursuing. He had been told to take Austrian territory and hold it as a bargaining counter for ultimate peacemaking. Opinion in the Directory was divided about what it should be bargained for. Most favored an Austrian recognition of a French frontier along the Rhine, although others, including Carnot, thought that a formula for endless future conflict. But nobody had foreseen, much less authorized, the carve-up of neutral states, or indeed the creation from French conquests of new sister republics. Such arrangements left nothing to bargain with, whereas on the matter of the Rhine frontier the Leoben terms were extremely ambiguous. The generals on the Rhine, no less than the Directory, were understandably furious. But the conclusion of peace preliminaries on his own authority was only the culmination of months of independent action by Bonaparte. In December 1796, he had prompted French sympathizers in cities freed by French arms from Modenese and papal rule to form themselves into a Cispadane republic, itself absorbed in June 1796 into the equally factitious Cisalpine one. By January, the civil commissioners normally attached to commanders in the field to ensure their compliance with government policy had been recalled, leaving him a completely free hand. After the fall of Mantua, he had, as the directors had long hoped, invaded the Papal States and extracted territorial concessions from the Pope. But so far from treating Pius VI as the irreconcilable enemy of the Republic and seeking to dethrone him, in the Treaty of Tolentino, 19th February, he merely underwrote the secession of the Cispadane cities, assuring the pontiff otherwise that he would find the French Republic, of all places, among the truest friends of Rome. Successful generals had dreamed of pursuing their own aims and ambitions ever since Dumouriez. But now one of them had won the entire war, and he felt perfectly entitled to dictate the terms of peace as well. Only Great Britain was now left fighting. And long before Leoben, she too had been exploring the possibilities of peace. There were no victories in 1796. merely mounting difficulties met by rising war taxation and overextending impressment and conscription. In October, after months of provocation from both sides, Spain joined France and declared war on the tyrant of the seas, Catherine of Russia. A stalwart anti-Jacobin, even if an inactive one beyond Eastern Europe, died in November. And the defeat of Austria was now acknowledged, even by Pitt and George III, to be merely a matter of time. As official peace mission was sent to France, the Directory strung it along. But by now, France was putting together a plan even bolder than the thrust in Italy. Jealous of Bonaparte's meteoric success, another young military protege, Lazare Hoche, who had pacified the Vendée and destroyed the Quiberon invasion force, was desperate for some further triumph to sustain his own prestige. He was thus ready to be persuaded by Wolfe Tone's repeated assurances that Ireland would rise against British rule if the French invaded it in reasonable force. The Directory, too, particularly Carnot, relished the idea of stirring up domestic subversion in the British Isles in the way the British had done in the rebellious French West. Accordingly, in December 1796, peace overtures were suddenly rebuffed, and a major expedition of 46 ships and almost 15,000 men set sail for Ireland. By the time they sighted their destination, however, Hoche's ships had been blown far out into the Atlantic, and they limped back to France without making a landing. Nor was it likely that, despite feverish preparations by the now underground organization of the United Irishmen, the sort of mass rising the French had been led to hope for on landing would have occurred. They arrived too soon, and at the wrong end of the country. Nevertheless, the landlords of the Anglo-Irish ascendancy were terrified, as was the government in London. February 1797 saw a serious run on the Bank of England, reflecting market anxieties about years of lending huge sums to unsuccessful allies like Austrians, but triggered by an emergency loan to Dublin for the strengthening of Irish defenses. with the combined naval strength of Spain and the Dutch to support them, it seemed certain that the French would soon be back. The panic subsided, although payments from the bank in gold remained suspended. With the news at the end of the month that the Spanish fleet had been crippled at St. Vincent. But only a few weeks later, the country was faced with the ultimate catastrophe: mutiny in the Royal Navy. Between March and June, the fleets at Spithead and the Nore were immobilized. by sailors demanding better pay, conditions, and rations. The Nore mutineers even blockaded the mouth of the Thames. They swore that should the French put to sea, they would happily put aside their dispute to fight them. And indeed, no serious evidence of subversion in the fleet has ever been found. As soon as the government conceded the sailors' main demands, the trouble subsided. And less than 24 ringleaders were hanged. But many suspected the influence of French agents, or worse, United Irishmen, and faith in the willingness and ability of the Navy to protect the country was only fully restored in October, when the Dutch fleet was destroyed at Camperdown, largely by vessels and crews involved in the mutinies. But long before that happened, the setbacks and narrow escapes of the spring had led Pitt to renew peace proposals to the French. Britannia might more or less rule the waves, but the Republic, however godless and Jacobinical, undoubtedly dominated the land. The war was plainly stalemated. Subversion might be under control in England, but Ireland, where the appearance of the French boosted United Irish hopes and recruitment, was a different matter. And everywhere there was an obvious war weariness. Accordingly, in June 1797, plenipotentiaries from the two sides began peace talks in Lille. Pitt was agreeably surprised by the polite welcome his approaches received. But the spring elections in France had returned many royalists who hoped an equitable settlement with the Bourbons' most determined supporters might smooth the way to a restoration. They pressed for similar give and take in the negotiations for a final settlement with the Austrians. Connaught, never a believer in immoderate gains, was prepared to go along with them. Bonaparte, however, was not, and he willingly cooperated in a plot to purge the ruling councils and the directory of royalists and moderates. On 4th September, troops commanded by Bonaparte's envoy Augereau stood by, while Carnot, with the leaders of the new batch of deputies, were expelled from public life in the coup of Fructidor. The French stance in negotiations with both Austria and Great Britain immediately hardened. The Austrians recognized that there was little point now in prolonging discussions about the finer points of their capitulation. By the Peace of Campo Formio, therefore October 18, the war begun in 1792 was at last brought to an end. The terms were roughly those of Leoben, and as then Bonaparte largely dictated them. Venice disappeared, partitioned between the Austrians and the Cisalpine Republic. France took her Ionian Islands. The general was already dreaming of imperial schemes in the eastern Mediterranean. Austria now also explicitly recognized France's Rhine frontier, but pointed out that this action could not commit the Holy Roman Empire at whose expense most of the Rhineland conquests had been made. To secure agreement there would have to be massive compensatory redistributions of territory, and the complexities were left to a later Congress fixed to meet in Rastatt. The sister republics of Italy, the Cisalpine, had now been joined by the Ligurian, formerly Genoa, were also recognized, and the loss of Belgium once more acknowledged. Belgium had brought Great Britain into the war, but so hopeless did the continental situation now appear that she too was prepared to acknowledge it as part of France. In fact, Pitt was ready to recognize all France's conquests in Europe, and to secure peace he was even willing to surrender gains made from France overseas. But the French demanded that he also restore overseas territories won from their Dutch and Spanish allies, including that key to India, the Cape. No compensations whatsoever were offered. The directors, masters of the continent, wanted nothing less than total surrender. But Pitt, desperate as he was for peace, was not yet that desperate. Negotiations were broken off, and a few weeks later, Camperdown emphasized continuing British strength. The ink was not yet dry on the Treaty of Campo Formio. In fact, before Thugut was investigating the possibilities of a second coalition based on Austro-British cooperation. But for the moment, the continent was at peace for the first time in 5 years, and Great Britain was left to fight on alone. The main aim of the French politicians who had launched this great struggle in 1792 had been force to their compatriots to come out clearly for or against the revolution. In this they succeeded far more thoroughly than they could have ever calculated. But the war also forced that choice on the rest of Europe, belligerent or not, especially after the French began to achieve victories. The withdrawal of the Republic's open-ended offer of fraternity and help to all sympathizers only 4 months after it was made passed unnoticed or unbelieved abroad. The French seemed intent on revolutionizing and republicanizing all Europe, if necessary by force of arms. Whatever their government said, Frenchmen abroad who were not émigrés openly encouraged their hosts to follow French examples. The ostentatious contempt of French residents in Spain for church and king throughout 1792, for instance, did much to predispose the government in Madrid towards the war that broke out earlier the next year. And Jacobins in Naples only came to the surface after a French fleet docked for repairs in the early days of 1793. They advertised their sympathies by founding a club, as did the few Mainzers around Forster, who had welcomed the French invaders of the Rhineland several weeks earlier, or the Poles of Warsaw and Wilno who defied the Russians in 1794. Or the patriots of the Dutch reading societies, who eagerly assembled to greet the oncoming liberators the following winter. By 1797, in fact, the year Burke died, still railing against the perils of a regicide peace, clubs had become the key to a new denunciation of the revolution that was to become every bit as influential as his great tract of 1790. It was embodied in the Memoirs to Serve for the History of Jacobinism by the ex-Jesuit Augustin de Bérulle, an opponent of the anti-clerical Enlightenment since long before 1789. Bérulle argued that the whole revolution had been a conspiracy of anti-Christian, anti-royal, and anti-social Freemasons bent on reducing civilization to chaos. The Bavarian Illuminati plot had merely been a rehearsal for the greater conspiracy that followed. Had not the Masonic slogan always been liberty, equality? The clubs now plaguing Europe were obviously Masonic lodges at last openly proclaiming their true purpose. In this way, Burke's hints about philosophic machinations were expanded to cover not just the origins of the revolution, but its whole, ever more radical course down to the very moment of Bérulle's publication. Those who were hitherto baffled in understanding the bewildering rush of events since 1789 found deep satisfaction in seeing it thus so comprehensively explained. The popularity of Bérulle's ideas proved ominous for all Freemasons. They had already been under suspicion everywhere since the upheavals had begun, and the fact that Masons were to be found among the leading revolutionaries in France and among the clubbists who welcomed French successes abroad now seemed more than the coincidence it was. Bérulle's allegations never won widespread acceptance in England, where Freemasonry had begun. But elsewhere they led to determined repression of Masonic activity and panicky abandonment of the lodges by the respectable, educated members of society who had flocked to join them in the quieter days of the Ancien regime. If Masonry was the cause of the French Revolution, that was bad enough. If it was also responsible for its course, even worse. For not only had the revolutionaries visited war and destruction on their neighbors, they had also fought and persecuted each other with vindictive savagery and allowed the Parisian mob to dictate the rest of the country and set about the systematic elimination of everybody who stood in their way through the cold machinery of the guillotine. The prospect of all this drove kings and queens particularly to distraction. "I should like this infamous nation to be cut to pieces," raved Maria Carolina of Naples, the sister of Marie Antoinette. "Annihilated, dishonored, reduced to nothing for at least 50 years. I hope that divine chastisement will fall visibly on France." Some argued that it already had, but the scenes which so shocked the rest of Europe in 1793 and 1794 were not the result of a Masonic conspiracy, or indeed any other sort. Very largely they were the consequence of the war so thoughtlessly launched in 1792, at a time when the triumphs of 1797 could never have been foreseen. Okay, that's the end of chapter 9.